Nightmare at the Museum. I don't have that many scary stories to tell you about my time at the museum because, frankly, nothing much ever really happened there. Nothing worth mentioning, anyway. I'm pretty sure I only got the job because my father was a long-term patron to the museum. God knows I had very little skills for the job, but it was a step up from working at a fast food restaurant, and the pay wasn't half bad. I was actually quite surprised by the amount of work I was expected to put in after hours, but it kind of made sense to work on the exhibits while no one else was around. I remember it was a Wednesday because the new ancient Egyptian exhibit was due to open on Friday, giving me just a few days to prepare. I was pissed about having to work so late, but I didn't really have a say in the matter, and it wasn't the first time I had been plagued with such unsocial working hours, although it was the first time I had ever seen a mummy arrive at the museum. Personally, I didn't see what the big deal was. He wasn't a pharaoh or a king. The museum couldn't afford those. Just some poor servant who was buried alive, inside a tomb 3,000 years ago. But I guess folks were still buying into all that nonsense about cursed mummies and the walking dead. I never gave the matter all that much thought, to be honest, and although being alone in a room with a corpse was kind of creepy, I didn't let it distract me too much from my after-hour duties at the museum. So it was the end of my shift, and after finishing up the day's work with the exhibit, I headed towards the door, but just as I was about to leave, I heard a noise from inside the room. Now, no one else was supposed to be at the museum except for the security guard, but he was posted at the front entrance, and I didn't see him enter the room. It wasn't long before I realized that the mummy had fallen out of place and was now leaning dangerously against the glass. Despite having a key, I wasn't actually qualified to personally handle any of the artifacts inside the museum. But I figured just a gentle push would be more than enough to resolve the issue, and I had at least a 5-minute window before the security guard would start checking the exhibits. There were cameras overlooking the exhibit, but I knew for a fact that they only checked them if they suspected something was missing or damaged. I tried desperately not to make any sudden movements, but after gently placing my hand on the mummy, I felt my arm retract almost immediately. It wasn't painful, just surprising to receive what felt like a sharp, static discharge from the mummy, but I was relieved to see that it had fallen back into place without causing any damage. I quickly closed the casing and headed towards the door before finally leaving the museum, to avoid drawing any attention. Despite the late night at the museum, I wasn't quite ready to go home just yet, so I decided to enjoy a quick drink at the local bar to unwind. Maybe it was the adrenaline keeping me awake, and I could still feel a strange tingling sensation in my hand. I started to think more about what took place back at the museum. The fact that I had just touched a 3,000-year-old mummy didn't really resonate with me until that moment, which was followed by a random thought of cursed dolls being possessed by evil spirits. You know the movies I'm talking about. Anyway, I wasn't quite prepared to go all the way down that rabbit hole just yet, and I quietly finished my last drink and prepared myself for a good night's sleep. That night, however, I was plagued by a strange dream which eventually caused me to wake up in the middle of the night to the horror of sleep paralysis. Something I had never experienced before, and not being able to feel the air in my chest was extremely frightening. I tried frantically to wiggle my fingers and toes to regain control of my body, but those attempts were soon met with a dark apparition standing in the corner. Unable to yell or scream for help, I could only hear my shallow breathing in the face of this dark presence, until I finally regained my senses. I sat up and realized that was as close to a near-death experience that I ever wanted to get, and I stayed awake for the rest of the night. The following morning was pretty rough. I came in late for work and I was in a crappy mood due to the combination of a hangover and lack of sleep from the night before. The day seemed to drag on forever, but eventually I did make it to the end of my shift. At that point, I was pretty sure that my mind was just playing tricks on me, but I couldn't dismiss the uncanny feeling that I was being watched. I arrived home exhausted, too tired to eat, so I just went straight to bed and figured I would eat some leftover pizza as soon as I woke up. However, I soon discovered that I would once again be deprived of a peaceful night's sleep. Similar to the night before, but still in a dreamlike state, I found myself gasping for air, before eventually waking up to the sound of shattered glass. It sounded so real I was convinced that someone was trying to break into my apartment. You know, like one of those strange crossovers between a dream and something that you hear in the real world, but I guess it wasn't that. At least that's what I thought until I realized there was blood on my hand. Coincidence? Had I somehow injured myself during the day and was too tired to notice? Since the wound appeared to be superficial and the bleeding had stopped, I didn't see any need to visit a doctor, and after cleaning myself up, I went back to bed and finally managed to fall asleep. The next morning I woke up feeling extremely well rested and enjoyed an early start at the museum. However, this was soon followed by a shocking discovery. The glass casing surrounding the mummy had been shattered. My initial concern was someone unexpectedly walking in and seeing the mess, which would prompt a review of the video footage from the cameras. I could only imagine what they would do if they found out that I had handled the mummy. Since I didn't have a key to the door, I couldn't lock it, so I quickly covered everything with a large sheet while I figured out what to do next. Nothing in the exhibit had been stolen, so I was quick to rule out a robbery. Despite my curiosity, finding a way to clean it all up seemed more pressing than finding out what caused it, so I decided to wait until the end of my shift when no one else was around. From that moment on, I found myself procrastinating over details that I had already attended to days before, just to appear busy and avoid any suspicion in case anyone came through those doors. As the museum began to close and the lights went out, the entire exhibit was plunged into moonlight, shining through the windows, and I began to acknowledge the disturbing similarities between my dream and what happened at the museum. It was at that moment that I could hear the sound of crushed glass, as though it was being stepped on. I froze in terror as the steps grew louder, and the all too familiar sense of a dark presence approached. I didn't feel physically paralyzed this time, but I was so afraid I couldn't dare to face what stood behind me. I didn't have the courage to go back to the museum after that, and I was fined for the damage caused to the exhibit. Oddly enough, there was a power outage on the night that the glass casing was shattered, so the cameras didn't pick anything up. But that didn't stop them from putting two and two together after seeing the footage of me handling the mummy. Clearly my contact with the mummy had somehow opened the door to something sinister, and it was only later on that I would come to realize that those kinds of doors often swing both ways. Hey folks, if you enjoy my horror animations, becoming a member of the channel is the best way to guarantee more content. I've also launched an official merch store, which is another great way to show your support. Links down below. If you like dark web horror stories, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on the next episode.